In Lochdubh, mornings arrived gently, as if reluctant to disturb anything that had survived the night. A pale mist clung to the edges of the single main road, curling lazily around stone cottages, whose chimneys breathed thin lines of smoke into the cold air. The sea lay just beyond the slope of land, common grey, murmuring to itself in a voice only the locals ever seemed to hear. Shops opened not by schedule but by habit. Mrs. McLean unlocked the door of the village store at the same unhurried pace she had kept for 30 years, stopping first to adjust the sign in the window and to nod at anyone who happened to be passing, which, at that hour, was usually no one except, perhaps, the postman, already late and unapologetic, or old Angus Ross taking his morning walk with a dog that no longer bothered to run. Life in Lochdubh did not hurry. It waited. Constable Hamish Macbeth stood just outside the police station, hands in his pockets, staring at the sky as if it might offer him something more interesting than the day he already expected. He had finished his tea too quickly and regretted it. There would be no excitement today, he was certain. There rarely was. A complaint about sheep wandering where they ought not to. A disagreement over a fence. Perhaps Mrs. Fletcher would ring again about youths speeding through the village, though the youths in question were usually delivery drivers from Inverness who passed through once and never returned. Hamish liked it that way. Peace suited him. Across the road stood the cottage that had once belonged to Morag Meekiver, the quiet widow. The locals still thought of it as hers, though she had lived alone there for nearly 12 years, since her husband's death had arrived quietly to in illness a hospital, and a polite funeral attended by people who felt they should remember him better than they did. Morag herself had never been much noticed. She was the sort of woman who walked the village paths without leaving footprints. She attended church irregularly, but sat in the same pew when she did. She bought the same groceries every week and spoke little beyond what was required. When greeted, she smiled. When asked a question, she answered, and when the conversation moved on, she did not follow. Some people mistook her silence for sadness. Others thought it was pride. Hamish had never been sure. He only knew that she observed more than she revealed, and that her eyes, pale and steady, had always seemed to be listening, even when her mouth was not. She had not opened her curtains that morning. At first, no one noticed. Curtains stayed closed for all sorts of reasons. A late night, a headache, the simple desire to be left alone. Lochdubh respected such things. But as the morning wore on and the mist began to lift, the cottage remained unchanged. No catasteme, no movement, no sign of Morag's habitual routine. Mrs. McLean was the first to mention it, later insisting she had felt something was wrong the moment she poured her second cup of tea. She said it casually at first, over the counter, while weighing potatoes for a customer who wasn't really listening. "Funny thing," she said, frowning slightly, "Morag hasn't been in yet." By midday, the absence had acquired weight. Hamish became aware of it not through a call or a knock at the station door, but through the way people spoke to him when they passed. There was a hesitation now, a brief pause before words resumed. Someone mentioned the weather, then stopped. Someone else asked after his mother, then glanced toward Morag's cottage before walking on. He told himself it meant nothing. Lochdubh noticed deviations, the way a body noticed a splinter instinctively, before reason had time to intervene. It was Mrs. Fletcher, who finally voiced what the others had been circling. "She didn't answer," she said, standing too close to Hamish's desk. "I knocked twice." Hamish looked up. Maybe she was sleeping. Mrs. Fletcher shook her head. "Morag never slept through noon, that was true." Morag's routines were quiet, but they were precise. Hamish took his jacket from the back of the chair and followed Mrs. Fletcher out into the pale afternoon. The village felt altered, though nothing visible had changed. The same gulls cried overhead. The same damp breeze rolled in from the sea. Yet there was a subtle tightening in the air, as if Lochdubh itself had drawn a breath and was waiting to see what would happen next. They did not force the door. They did not need to. Inside, the cottage smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Everything was in its place. The kettle sat cold on the stove. A book lay open on the small table by the window, a finger marking the page where reading had stopped. Morag Micibhir lay in her bed as though she had simply decided not to get up. Hamish stood very still. There was no blood, no sign of disturbance, no violence to announce itself, only a final stillness that did not belong to sleep. The doctor would later confirm what Hamish already suspected, that Morag had not died peacefully, that something subtle, unseen, had intervened. But in that first moment, what struck Hamish most was not the mystery of her death. It was the quietness of her life and how completely it had folded back into silence. Word spread quickly, but softly. Doors closed. Voices lowered. The village gathered itself around the absence, trying to understand how someone could vanish so thoroughly while never truly having been known. As Hamish stepped back outside, he glanced once more at the cottage. The curtains stirred slightly in the breeze now, as if acknowledging the attention they had finally received. Lochdubh would go on. He knew that. It always did. But it would remember. And so would he. By the following morning, Lochdubh had rearranged itself around the knowledge it could not quite say aloud. The news of Morag Micibhir's death had passed from house to house, with the discretion usually reserved for illnesses and deaths. No one announced it. No one needed to. It was there in the way doors closed more carefully, in the way conversations drifted and then stalled, as if words themselves were uncertain how close they were allowed to come. The sea was rougher than usual, though the sky remained clear. Hamish noticed that, as he walked the length of the village, his pace unhurried, his eyes taking in details he had passed 1,000 times before. The boats rocked against the pier with a touch more impatience. Gulls cried louder, or perhaps people were simply listening harder. Morag's cottage stood quiet, its door now firmly shut, a polite barrier between the living and whatever explanations had yet to surface. A faint sense of intrusion lingered around it, as though the house itself resented the sudden interest. Hamish had asked the doctor not to say more than necessary. Official words had a way of stiffening people, and Lochdubh responded poorly to stiffness. It preferred suggestion, implication, the long glance over a teacup. Still, the truth had a way of seeping through even the smallest cracks. She didn't suffer, the doctor had said quietly, but she didn't simply drift off. That was enough. More than enough. In the shop, Mrs. McLean served customers with unusual efficiency, as if keeping busy might prevent thought from settling. She spoke of the price of flour, of a delayed delivery, of the weather forecasts. She didn't entirely trust. Only once did she falter, glancing toward the window that faced Morag's usual path. "She always came on Thursdays," she said suddenly, then pressed her lips together as if surprised by herself. Same time, same list. Never changed her mind. Hamish nodded, encouraging without prompting. "Did she seem worried lately?" he asked gently. Mrs. McLean frowned, searching her memory. No more than usual. If anything, calmer. Calmer was an odd word to choose, and Hamish noted it. People did not often describe Morag at all, let alone with such specificity. Outside, Mrs. Fletcher was already holding court, though her voice was subdued. She spoke of Morag's late husband, of how grief could linger quietly, of how some people never truly recovered, others not grateful for an explanation that required no further digging. But there were dissenting glances too. A few villagers exchanged looks that suggested Morag's life had not been quite as empty as they liked to believe. At the post office, young Jamie Fraser admitted Morag had been receiving letters. Not many, not often, but enough to be noticed. "Handwritten," he said. "Neat. Always the same writing." "From where?" Hamish asked. Jamie shrugged. No return address, but the stamps were local. Inverness, maybe. Another small stone dropped into still water. As the day wore on, Hamish let the village speak to him in its own way. He did not interrogate. He listened. He accepted tea he did not want, and biscuits he did not need. He asked about Morag's habits, her walks, her silences. Slowly, a shape began to form, not of a crime, but of a person. Morag had walked every afternoon along the shore path, regardless of whether she had stood sometimes at the same spot, looking out to sea, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Once, someone recalled, she had been joined there by another figure, though no one could quite remember who. "She didn't gossip," Mrs. Fletcher said later, as if that were suspicious. "Not like the rest of us." Hamish smiled faintly. That might have been her mistake. By evening, the village had settled into a fragile calm. Lamps glowed in cottage windows. Suppers were eaten. Radios murmured quietly in the background. And beneath it all ran a thin current of Annie's not fear. Exactly, but displacement. The sense that something had slipped sideways without warning. Hamish returned to the station and sat at his desk, staring at nothing in particular. The case would be noted. Reports would be filed. But this was not a matter of facts alone. Lochdubh would not be unlocked by procedure. Morag had lived among them for years without being claimed by them. Now, in death, she had their full attention. That, Hamish thought, was telling. He closed his eyes briefly and pictured her as she had been, walking steadily, eyes forward, neither inviting nor refusing company. A woman who had chosen quiet, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood the cost of speaking. Somewhere in that understanding lay the reason she was gone. Outside, the sea struck the rocks with renewed insistence, as though reminding the village that calm surfaces often conceal deeper movements below. Lochdubh, wrapped in darkness and habit, listened and waited. The days following Morag MacIvor's death did not announce themselves as days of investigation. Lochdubh did not change its routines for something as impolite as suspicion. It continued to wake slowly, to open its shops when it felt ready, to speak in half-finished sentences that assumed understanding rather than demanded it. Yet beneath that steadiness, a quiet rebalancing was taking place, as subtle as the shifting of stones beneath a shallow stream. Hamish Macbeth noticed it most in the pauses. People lingered longer at doorways. They watched one another with a care that might have passed for kindness if it had not been threaded with unease. Conversations ended not with conclusions, but with glances, as though the village itself had become aware of being overheard. Morag's funeral was set for the end of the week. The minister spoke of dignity and restraint, words that seemed chosen less for comfort than for accuracy. Morag, who had lived unobtrusively, was now being described with a precision that bordered on reverence. It struck Hamish as strange that only in death had she become fully visible. After the service, the villagers gathered outside the kirk, uncertain what to do with themselves. No one rushed away, no one seemed eager to speak. The silence was companionable, but it carried weight. She liked the hymns, Mrs. McLean said at last, as if offering a fact to anchor them all. Always sang softly, though you had to listen for her. Hamish listened now, not for Morag's voice, but for the spaces she had left behind. Later that afternoon, he walked a shore path she had favoured, moving at the same steady pace she had kept. The sea was calm again, the water a flat stretch of steel grey that mirrored the sky. At the place where the path curved inward, he stopped. Someone had been there recently. The grass was pressed down in two distinct patterns, as if two people had stood side by side, both facing the water. One set of footprints was lighter, less certain. The other was firm, familiar. Hamish crouched, touching the ground lightly. There was nothing incriminating there. No clues that would satisfy a court or a headline. Only the quiet suggestion of companionship. He thought of the letters, of the calm Mrs. McLean had mentioned, of the way Morag had looked outward, toward the horizon, as though listening for something beyond the village's reach. Back in Lochdubh, he called on those who had known Morag longest, though known was perhaps too generous a word. Old Mrs. Bain remembered Morag as a girl, before marriage had settled like a veil over her life. She was sharper then, Mrs. Bain said, eyes bright with memory, not unkind, just observant. She saw things people didn't like being seen. And after her husband died? Hamish asked. Mrs. Bain's mouth tightened. After that, she learned when to stay quiet. That, Hamish thought, was closer to the truth than anyone realized. At the post office, Jamie produced one of the envelopes Morag had received. Held carefully as though it might speak if mishandled, Hamish studied the handwriting, again a measured, deliberate, familiar, in a way he could not yet place. "Anyone else in the village write like that?" he asked. Jamie hesitated. "Maybe, but not many." The answer was evasive without being dishonest. Another pause. Another absence. As evening fell, Hamish sat in the small sitting room of his cottage, tea cooling untouched beside him. He considered what he had learned and, more importantly, what he had not. No one had spoken ill of Morag. No one had claimed intimacy. Yet she had not lived unseen. She had been noticed, remembered, written to. It occurred to him then that Morag had known something about Lochdubh that Lochdubh had preferred not to know about itself. The thought settled heavily. When Hamish returned to the station the next morning, a single note lay on his desk. No signature. No explanation. Just a few careful words written in the same measured hand as the letters Morag had received. She never knew when to let go. Hamish read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in his pocket. The message was not a threat. It was not a confession. It was something far more unsettling. It was an opinion. Outside, the village moved on, as it always did. But Hamish felt the shift now, the subtle tightening of relationships. The way history could bind or suffocate depending on how closely one looked. Morag, Mikiver had looked closely, and someone, somewhere in Lochdubh, had not forgiven her for it. Hamish did not show the note to anyone. He carried it folded in his jacket pocket, where it warmed slightly with his body heat, as if absorbing something of him in return. Notes like that were rarely meant to be read aloud. They were confessions of a quieter sort, offered not to the law but to conscience. Lochdubh, for its part, continued to behave impeccably. The village council met that evening in a small hall behind the kirk, and Hamish attended not as an officer but as a neighbour. The chairs scraped softly against the floor. Tea was poured. Biscuits were passed along without comment. The agenda was discussed with the usual solemnity: road repairs, a leaking roof, the matter of the sheep gate that refused to stay shut. Morag's name did not come up. That omission spoke louder than any words. Hamish watched the faces around the table as they spoke. Noting the way some people avoided looking toward the empty chair Morag would never have taken, and the way others glanced at it despite themselves. The village had always preferred its tragedies contained, wrapped neatly in propriety. After the meeting, Hamish lingered, helping to stack chairs he had no responsibility to move. It gave him an excuse to listen. "She was always polite," someone said near the door. "Never caused trouble." "That's not the same as being harmless," another replied, quickly and quietly. The words stayed with him as he walked home through the narrow streets. Windows glowed softly, each one a small island of warmth. Somewhere, a radio played an old tune, its melody carrying faintly through the air. Life undisturbed on the surface. The following day, Hamish visited Morag's cottage again. Officially, there was nothing left to do there. Unofficially, he felt the need to see the space once more. Now that the initial shock had faded, the house was as he remembered it: orderly, restrained, deeply personal without being expressive. On the mantelpiece stood a single photograph of Morag as a young woman, her expression unreadable even then. No family portraits, no sentimental clutter. In the small bedroom, he noticed something he had missed before. The book by the window was not a novel, but a ledger. Names were written inside, dates beside them, small notations in the margins, careful and sparse. It was not a diary. It was a record. Hamish read only a few entries before closing it again. He did not need to know more yet. The existence of the book was enough. Outside, he encountered Mrs. McLean, who had come to water the small patch of flowers she had planted years ago at the edge of Morag's fence. She startled when she saw him, then laughed softly at herself. "I keep forgetting," she said. "For a moment. I think she'll come out and tell me I'm using too much water." "She ever complain?" Hamish asked. Mrs. McLean shook her head. "No," but she noticed that word again. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the water soak into the soil. "Did Morag ever confide in you?" Hamish asked at last. Mrs. McLean hesitated, then shrugged. "Not directly, but sometimes she'd ask questions, careful ones, about people, about things that happened years ago. And did that trouble you?" Mrs. McLean considered. "At the time, no. Looking back, perhaps it should have." As Hamish walked away, he felt the shape of the mystery tightening not around an act, but around a history. Morag had been a keeper of small truths, the kind that villages pretended not to remember, but never fully forgot. That evening, the post office closed early. Jamie said nothing when Hamish asked why, but his hands shook slightly as he counted change. When Hamish mentioned the letters again, Jamie flushed. "I didn't mean any harm," he said quickly. "I only thought someone should know." "Know what?" Hamish asked. Jamie swallowed. "That she wasn't as alone as people think." The words echoed. Hamish left as the light faded, his thoughts circling the same quiet realization. Morag's death was not about anger or greed or passion. It was about exposure, about the danger of remembering when others had agreed to forget. And somewhere in Lochdubh, someone was afraid that Morag had remembered too much. The village slept that night, beneath a calm sky, unwilling to be aware that its stillness was beginning to crack. The first real change in Lochdubh arrived quietly in the form of avoidance. Hamish noticed it the morning after his visit to Morag's cottage, when doors that had once opened easily now paused before doing so. People still greeted him, still offered tea, still spoke of ordinary things, but there was a new caution in their eyes, a slight tightening around the mouth, as though each word were being weighed before release. It was not hostility. Lochdubh was not built for confrontation. It was something gentler and more troubling. Self-protection. At the shop, Mrs. McLean spoke at length about a missing delivery and the difficulty of keeping fresh produce in damp weather. She did not mention Morag at all. When Hamish gently steered the conversation back, her hand stilled on the counter. "I've already said what I know," she said, not unkindly, "and what I don't." Hamish accepted the boundary. Pressing too hard in a village like Lochdubh only drove truth deeper underground. He walked instead, letting the village reveal itself the way it always had through small gestures, habits left unchanged. Near the harbour, two men who normally argued loudly about fishing quotas fell silent when he approached. On the road near the kirk, Mrs. Bain crossed to the other side, then waved apologetically as if remembering something she had forgotten to do. Even Jamie at the post office, once eager to talk, now kept his answers brief. The ledger of Mirog's life seemed to have unsettled something larger than Hamish had expected. That afternoon, Hamish took the long way home, passing the row of older cottages at the edge of the village. One window, usually bare, now displayed a lace curtain that had not been there before. A subtle signal, a desire for separation. He stopped walking. For the first time since Mirog's death, Hamish allowed himself to consider not who might have harmed her, but who might have felt threatened by her continued presence. In Lochdubh, reputations were built slowly and maintained carefully. A long memory could be as dangerous as an accusation. Morag had kept records, not dramatic ones, not secrets in the usual sense, but she had noticed patterns: who came and went, who spoke and who avoided speaking, who altered their stories over time. Such noticing, done quietly, could feel like judgment even when none was intended. That evening, Hamish returned to the shore path. The tide was low, exposing dark bands of seaweed along the rocks. He stood again where Morag had once stood, imagining the view as she had seen it, not as escape, but as distance. The sea did not ask questions. It did not remember. Someone else joined him, approaching without haste. Mrs. Fletcher stood a few steps away, arms folded loosely, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "She liked it here," she said it helped her think. "What did she think about?" Hamish asked. Mrs. Fletcher smiled faintly. "Other people." They stood together in silence. "She once asked me," Mrs. Fletcher continued, "whether you can live somewhere your whole life and still not belong to it." Hamish considered that. "What did you say?" "That it depends on how much you know." After a moment, Mrs. Fletcher sighed. "I think she knew too much." The admission surprised Hamish, not because it confirmed his suspicions, but because of the relief with which it was offered, as if saying it aloud lifted a weight. "Did she ever tell you anything specific?" he asked. Mrs. Fletcher shook her head. "No, and that's the worst part. She never accused. She never threatened. She just remembered." The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of salt and kelp. Mrs. Fletcher shivered. "She was kind," she added. "People forget that." Hamish walked home under a darkening sky, the lights of the village flickering on one by one. Kindness, he reflected, was often mistaken for harmlessness, and harmlessness, when paired with knowledge, could become intolerable. At the station, he took out the note again and read it by lamplight. She never knew when to let go. It was not anger that spoke through those words. It was fear that something once buried might resurface, reshaped by memory. Hamish thought of the ledger, of the careful handwriting, of the way Morag had lived without demanding attention, yet had somehow become unavoidable. By the time he went to bed, he understood something the village was only beginning to sense. Morag Meekivor had not been killed because she spoke. She had been killed because she didn't. And someone, somewhere in Lochdubh, had grown tired of waiting to see what she might remember next. The turning point, when it came, did not arrive with revelation or confession. It arrived as a feeling Hamish could not ignore, a subtle wrongness that settled in the village like a change in the weather. Nothing specific had shifted, yet everything felt slightly out of alignment, as though Lochdubh had begun telling itself a story it no longer fully believed. Hamish spent that morning doing nothing that looked like work. He walked, he listened, he allowed conversations to happen around him without guiding them. In a place like Lochdubh, effort drew attention, stillness invited truth. At the harbour, he sat on an upturned crate while two fishermen argued half-heartedly about tides. Their voices rose and fell without conviction, the disagreement familiar and safe. When Hamish mentioned Morag's name casually, both men fell quiet, then resumed speaking as though nothing had been said. But their rhythm was gone. Later, near the kirk, he watched Mrs. Bain struggle with the door, her hands unsteady. He offered help, which she accepted with visible relief. Inside, the air smelled of polish and old hymenals. "You look tired," Hamish said gently. She sighed, lowering herself onto a pew. "I don't sleep well any more." "Since Morag?" he asked. Mrs. Bain nodded once. "Since before that, if I'm honest." She stared at the altar, eyes unfocused. "She used to ask me about my brother Hamish waited. He left the village years ago," she continued. "Well, that's what we told people. Morag knew better." "Knew what?" Hamish asked quietly. Mrs. Bain's hands twisted in her lap. "That he didn't leave. Not properly." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. "She never accused," Mrs. Bain said again, echoing a phrase Hamish had heard too often now to ignore. "But she remembered the day he didn't come home, the way people stopped asking questions." Hamish felt the shape of the truth turning, aligning. "Did that frighten you?" he asked. Mrs. Bain nodded, tears forming but not falling. "It frightened all of us." That afternoon, Hamish returned to Morag's ledger. He did not read it this time. He studied its margins. The small symbols she had used marks of attention, not judgment. Dates circled, names underlined once, never twice. A system meant for recall, not exposure. Morag had not been collecting evidence. She had been preserving memory. The village had relied on forgetting. As evening approached, Hamish visited one last place, the modest house, at the edge of Lochdubh, where the lights were always on early and the curtains drawn before dusk. Inside lived Veen Fraser, a man so unremarkable that he was often overlooked even by those who had known him all their lives. Ewan welcomed Hamish politely, offering tea with hands that shook just enough to be noticed. "She was a good woman," Ewan said, unprompted. "Morag?" Hamish nodded. "She was." Ewan stared into his cup. She knew things about people. Old things. "Yes," Hamish said. "She did." Silence stretched. "I didn't mean for her to die," Ewan said finally, his voice flat, almost distant. "I only wanted her to stop watching." Hamish did not react. He did not need to. Ewan spoke of years-old guilt, of an accident no one had named, of a village that had quietly agreed to let the past sink beneath routine. Morag had been there. She had seen. She had remembered. "She never threatened me," Ewan said. "But every time she looked at me, I thought she might." "And that was enough," Hamish said. Ewan nodded. It had not taken force, only a small, deliberate intervention. A quiet adjustment that mirrored the quiet life Morag had lived. When Hamish left, the night was clear, the stars sharp above the village. Lochdubh slept, unaware that its carefully balanced silence had tipped. The truth, when it surfaced, did not shatter the village. It settled into it, heavy but contained, and Hamish knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that this was not an ending but a reckoning long overdue. The confession did not travel through Lochdubh the way gossip usually did. There were no whispers passed at the shop counter, no quick glances exchanged on the road. Instead, the knowledge seeped outward slowly, absorbed rather than announced, like rain sinking into dry ground. Hamish did not arrest Ewan Fraser that night. He walked back through the village alone, giving the darkened cottages the courtesy of silence. There would be procedures later, conversations with Inverness, paperwork that would speak a language Lochdubh preferred not to learn. For now, it was enough to let the truth exist without spectacle. By morning, the village sensed it anyway. People woke with the uneasy feeling that something long avoided had finally shifted. Mrs. Bain did not open her curtains until nearly noon. Jamie at the post office miscounted change twice before noticing. At the harbour, the fishermen worked without their usual complaints. Each movement deliberate, subdued. Morag's name returned to conversation, not cautiously this time, but with a new weight. "She was right," then someone murmured near the shop. "She always was," another replied. Hamish listened without interrupting. What interested him was not the conclusion they were reaching, but the relief threaded through it. Truth, even painful truth, loosened something inside people. It allowed them to breathe again. Still, not everyone welcomed it. At the council hall, where Hamish stopped later that day, he encountered resistance disguised as concern. "There's no need to drag everything up," one man said quietly. "What's done is done." Hamish met his gaze. It wasn't done for Morag. That ended the conversation. In the afternoon, Hamish returned once more to the shore path. The tide was high now, the water pressing close to the grass where Morag had once stood. He imagined her there again, not accusing, not demanding, simply present. A witness in a village that had grown used to being unwatched. Mrs. Fletcher joined him as she had before. "They're talking," she said. Hamish replied. "They will." She folded her arms, watching the water. "Some are angry." "They would be," Hamish said. "Anger's easier than guilt." She nodded. "And Ewan," he told the truth. Hamish said carefully, "That matters." Mrs. Fletcher did not press further. Lochdubh understood limits. As evening approached, a quiet gathering formed outside Morag's cottage. No one had planned it. People simply arrived, standing in small clusters, hands folded, eyes lowered. Someone placed flowers near the door. Someone else lit a candle, shielding the flame from the wind. Hamish stood apart, observing. No speeches were made, no prayers spoken aloud. The silence was intentional, almost reverent. For the first time, Morag was not overlooked. Inside the cottage, the ledger remained where Hamish had left it. He would take it later, file it away where it could no longer trouble anyone. But for now, it stood a testament to memory preserved rather than erased. The villagers drifted away one by one, returning to their routines with care. Lochdubh did not unravel under the weight of what it had remembered. It adjusted. It always had. That night, Hamish sat at his desk, writing his report with deliberate calm. He did not embellish. He did not soften. He stated facts, trusting that time would do the rest. When he finished, he set down his pen and listened to the village settling around him. The sea murmured, as it always had. A dog barked once, then fell silent. Somewhere, a door closed gently. Morag McKeever had lived quietly. She had died quietly, too, but the echo of her presence would linger, woven now into the fabric of Lochdubh's shared memories. As Hamish turned off the lamp and prepared for sleep, he felt a familiar comfort return. The case had not ended cleanly. Few ever did, but the village had faced itself, and that was no small thing. Tomorrow, life would resume its slow, steady pace. There would be sheep on the road, complaints about the weather, tea poured without ceremony, and beneath it all, Lochdubh would remember just enough. Time in Lochdubh resumed its ordinary shape with surprising ease. The days following the quiet gathering outside Morag's cottage did not carry the heaviness one might have expected. Instead, there was a cautious gentleness to everything, as if the village had learned how to move again after holding itself to still for too long. Hamish noticed it first in the small things. Mrs. McLean reopened her shop at the usual hour, but she placed a small vase of fresh flowers near the till, something she had not done since her husband's death. At the post office, Jamie hummed while sorting letters, his shoulders no longer drawn up around his ears. Even Mrs. Bain began to take her morning walk again, though she kept her eyes on the road ahead and her pace slower than before. Morag's cottage, however, remained unchanged. Its stillness now felt intentional rather than unsettling, like a closed book that had been read carefully and set aside. Hamish had spoken to Inverness, as he was obliged to do. Arrangements were made, statements taken. The larger machinery of law turned quietly, respectful of the village it passed through. Ewan Fraser was not paraded or condemned in public. He was simply removed, one absence replacing another, though this one came with explanation. What lingered instead was Morag's ledger. Hamish did not take it right away. He returned to the cottage one last time, sitting at the small table by the window, the ledger open before him. Sunlight filtered through thin curtains, illuminating the careful lines of ink. The entries were mundane at first glance. Dates, names, small observations, but read slowly, they revealed a different truth, not of wrongdoing catalogued, but of relationships mapped. Who avoided whom? Who grew quieter over the years? Who changed after certain events that were never spoken of again? Morag had not been building a case. She had been bearing witness. Hamish closed the ledger and leaned back, understanding now why its existence had unsettled the village so deeply. It was not evidence that frightened them. It was remembrance. In Lochdubh, forgetting had been an unspoken agreement, a kindness offered to those who needed it most. Morag had never broken that agreement. Allowed, but she had never signed it either. Outside, footsteps approached. Hamish looked up to see Mrs. Fletcher standing in the doorway, hands clasped. "I thought I might find you here," she said softly. "You usually do," Hamish replied. She glanced at the ledger. "Will you take it?" "Yes," he said after a moment, "but not to bury it." She nodded, satisfied. They stood together in the quiet room, sharing the stillness without needing to fill it. Later that afternoon, Hamish carried the ledger back to the station, wrapped carefully in brown paper. He filed it not as evidence, but as record, something to be preserved rather than prosecuted. Some truths, he knew, did not belong to courts. They belonged to memory. The village, meanwhile, began to speak of Morag with a new ease. She always listened, someone said at the harbour. She remembered birthdays, said another. She never judged. A third added, surprising even themselves. It was as though, in acknowledging what she had known, they were finally allowing themselves to know her. That evening Hamish walked the length of Lochdubh as dusk settled in. Lights appeared one by one, steady and reassuring. The sea reflected the fading sky. Come once more, he paused near the shore path, where the grass had long since risen back into place. No trace remained of the two figures who had once stood there together, and yet the spot felt marked not by tragedy but by understanding. Morag's story had not ended with her death. It had simply changed form. As Hamish turned back toward the village, he felt the familiar comfort of continuity settled around him. Lochdubh would go on, carrying its secrets gently, aware now of the cost of forgetting the completely, and somewhere within its quiet rhythm, Morag Meekiver remained still watching, still listening, still remembered. Not loudly, but enough. With the formalities completed and the ledger safely filed away, Lochdubh began the slow work of living with what it now knew. Not correcting it, not fixing it, simply accommodating it, the way the village accommodated bad weather or lows, or the gradual erosion of the shoreline. Knowledge, once admitted, had to be made room for. Hamish felt that shift most keenly in the way people spoke to one another. There was a new attentiveness in conversations, a gentler pacing. People listened longer before replying. Silences were allowed to stretch without being hurried along. It was as though Morag's habit of observation had quietly passed to the rest of them, leaving behind a village slightly more awake to itself. One afternoon Hamish found himself at the shop again, leaning against the counter while Mrs. McLean rang up a modest collection of groceries. She paused before handing him the change. "I've been thinking," she said. Hamish waited. "About all the years she came in here. All the things I never asked." "You respected her privacy," Hamish said. Mrs. McLean nodded. "Yes, but I wonder now if I hid behind that." Hamish smiled gently. "There's a difference between respecting silence and hiding inside it." "You'll know which is which next time." Mrs. McLean exhaled, as if relieved to have the thought named. Elsewhere in the village, similar reckonings were taking place. Mrs. Bain invited her sister to visit for the first time in years. Jamie at the post office began staying open later, lingering to talk with customers rather than ushering them out. Even the fishermen at the harbor seemed less inclined to argue, their debates softer, less defensive. Lochdubh was not reinventing itself. It was adjusting its posture. Hamish, meanwhile, found himself reflecting on Morag more often than he expected. Not on the manner of her death, which had already begun to feel like a closed chapter, but on the life she had lived alongside everyone else, without ever fully entering their narratives. He realized, with some discomfort, that he too had underestimated her. He had seen her as quiet, observant, harmless, useful descriptors but incomplete ones. She had been deliberate. The thought stayed with him as he walked the shore path one late afternoon, the sky streaked with pale golden gray. The tide was halfway out, the sea breathing steadily against the rocks. He stopped, as he often did now, at the place where Morag had stood. This time he did not imagine her alone. He imagined the village as she must have seen it, not as a collection of houses and habits, but as a living thing, shaped by memory and omission, a place where kindness and fear often shared the same fate. Hamish understood then that Morag's greatest act of defiance had not been remembering, but choosing not to use what she remembered as a weapon. She had trusted the village to face itself eventually. It had taken her death to force that moment. As dusk settled, Hamish turned back toward Lochdubh, his steps unheard. Lights were already appearing in windows, steady and familiar. Smoke rose from chimneys, carrying the comforting scent of peat. At the station, he found a small envelope waiting on his desk. The handwriting was unfamiliar this time, less precise, slightly uneven. Inside was a short note. "Thank you for letting her be known." There was no name. Hamish folded the note carefully and placed it beside the Legion's fire, aware that this too was a kind of record, one that required no further action. Outside, the village settled into evening. Doors closed. Radios murmured. A dog barked, then quieted. Life continued as it always did, but something had changed. Not dramatically, not visibly, only in the way Lochdubh now held its silences with Maury Curry and a little less fear. Hamish turned off the lamp and sat for a moment in the dark, listening. The village sounded the same as ever, yet beneath the familiar rhythms there was a deeper steadiness now, as if something long out of balance had finally found its place. Morag Mikiver had lived quietly, watched carefully, and left without spectacle. But her presence lingered not as accusation, not as warning, but as a reminder that even the quietest lives leave traces. And Lochdubh, for all its secrets, would remember that. Not always, but enough. The season turned, almost without notice. One morning the air carried a softer edge, and the hills beyond Lochdubh appeared less stern, their outlines gentled by pale light. Spring did not arrive boldly here. It eased itself in, careful not to disturb what had settled. Hamish Macbeth welcomed it without ceremony. The village resumed its rhythms fully now, not as a return to how things had been, but as a continuation shaped by what had passed. Sheep wandered onto the road and were herded back with familiar muttering. The shop filled with the usual complaints about prices and weather. Children's voices carried farther in the afternoons, sharper against the thinning cold. Morag Mikiver's cottage was eventually claimed by ivy and silence again. The flowers left at her door faded and were cleared away, not in dismissal but in acceptance. Mrs. McLean took it upon herself to keep the small patch of ground tidy, never saying why, never being asked. Hamish walked past the cottage often, slowing just enough to acknowledge it. He no longer felt the pull of unfinished business there. Whatever had needed to surface had done so. What remained was quieter. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the sea, Hamish took the shore path once more. The tide was out, revealing the familiar stretch of sand and stone. The wind was mild, the kind that carried sound without scattering it. He stopped at the place. He always stopped. For the first time, he did not think of Morag as an absence. He thought of her as part of the landscape woven into the habits of the village, the way certain bends in the road or hollows in the hills became known without ever being named. Lochdubh would not speak of her often now. That was its nature. But it would remember her in small, unconscious ways, in questions asked a little more carefully, in silences held without discomfort, in glances that lingered, not with suspicion, but with understanding. Hamish smiled faintly at the thought. Behind him, footsteps approached. He did not turn right away, still standing here. Then Mrs. Fletcher said, her voice light. "Habit," Hamish replied. She joined him, hands in her pockets, gazing out at the water. "People are settling again." "Yes," he said. "They do that." She hesitated. "Do you think it will last?" Hamish considered. "Nothing lasts, but some things change how we last." Mrs. Fletcher nodded, satisfied with that. They stood together for a while, saying nothing. The sea rolled in gently, indifferent and eternal. When Hamish returned to the village, evening had settled fully. Lights glowed warmly behind curtains. The air smelled of cooking, of peat smoke and salt. A sense of continuity wrapped itself around him, familiar and reassuring. At the station, Hamish completed one final task. He opened the file bearing Morog's name and added a brief note. Nothing that would ever be required reading. Just a sentence, written in his own careful hand, witnessed quietly. Remembered enough. He closed the file and placed it back where it belonged. Outside, Lochdubh slept, its secrets folded gently into its bones. The village had not been redeemed nor condemned. It had simply been understood a little more clearly than before. Hamish turned off the lamp and sat for a moment in the dark, listening to the familiar sounds, the distant sea, the wind against stone, the quiet persistence of life continuing. Tomorrow would come, and the day after that. Lochdubh would endure as it always had, come on the surface, layered beneath, holding stories that did not demand to be told, only to be carried. And somewhere in that careful balance, the quiet widow of Lochdubh remained no longer unseen, no longer alone, but part of the village's long, unspoken memory, a presence not felt sharply, but steadily. And, in the end, that was enough.